Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's Clan Macpherson Museum History and Heritage Talk. We're absolutely delighted to have Tanner Ogle with us all the way from the United States. So thank you very much, Tanner, for joining us this evening. So to introduce Tanner, Tanner is a PhD student at Texas A&M University, and his research focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, and empire within British imperial memory. He's received numerous graduate fellowships supporting his research at 5 archives in Scotland last year, and he's planning a return in May of this year, so next month. Fantastic, awesome, for research in London, Nottingham, Inverary, and Edinburgh. Although I think, as you were saying earlier, London is going to dominate, isn't it? Oh well. Yeah. Okay, at least we get to go to Scotland a little bit. And Tanner's recently published an article, Republicans Resurrected Memories of the English Civil War and Peaceful Transatlantic Resistance in the Beginning of the American Revolution. That's recently appeared in the Journal of Religious History, Literature and Culture. And his current research focuses on how living memories of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 influenced perceptions and policies on both sides of the Atlantic during the American Revolution. So that's what Tanner's going to be talking about this evening. His talk is entitled The 45 in 75, Memories of Jacobitism and the Rebellious Turn in the American Revolution. So over to you, Tanner. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming tonight. I greatly appreciate it. I didn't actually start off on this. The article that was shared earlier is where I actually began. So this project came up on accident. I didn't expect to be studying Scottish history, but as PhDs enter their dissertations, oftentimes things take a course of their own. So let's begin. On March 14th, 1774, the Boston Post Boy reviewed the history of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. Published just a week before Parliament passed the first coercive act for Massachusetts, the Boston Post Boy recalled that while the British fought on the continent in 1745, the Jacobite rebels advanced south from Scotland as far as Derby. With Jacobites approaching the capital, one of the lords in waiting advised George II to flee from London until peace was restored. The monarch refused. Putting full confidence in the patriots of London, he raised his standard at Finchley Commons and resolved to die King of England rather than flee from the young pretender. Yet in 1774, the article claimed that imperial politics had changed. The loyal Britons no longer faced Jacobites on the open field. Instead, the article argued, the rebels have come in at the back door. Centering on broad patterns of remembrance between 1774 and 1776, this study makes 3 points that help explain why Britain failed to restore peace in America. First, the paper uses memory as a method to gauge the deployment of complex rebellious rhetoric, not merely labeling a political opponent a Jacobite, but comparing details between the past and present. The North Ministry's consistent use of the memory of the 45 in both Parliament and government propaganda demonstrates how British politicians perceived their contemporary moment and how early and aggressively the North Ministry pursued a policy of rebellion in America. Second, while declaring rebellion was vehemently contested, so too were other legal and military policies that the North Ministry based on the 45, as well as other economic and religious policies that the ministry did not initially revive. This division in the mid-1770s markedly contrasted the memories of patriotic fervor that united the country during the Jacobite Rebellion and indicates how divisive the American conflict was at home. Finally, feeding off the anti-Scottish Wilkes movement, conspiratorial fears of an ideological shift in government seem to be confirmed as formerly disloyal people and places widely supported the war with the American colonies. These fears eroded confidence in the imperial government and excited colonists to begin treating loyalists as rebels, furthering the transition to war. Once imperial officials deployed a rhetoric of rebellion in 1774 and 1775, it forced colonists to choose their allegiance. But for many Americans and Britons, it was Lord North's administration who seemed seditious. Given the significance of the 45 to imperial policies and conspiratorial fears, I argue that the causes of the American Revolution need to be studied from a longer imperial perspective that explores imperial changes, not from 1763, but 1745. Following the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, the North Ministry began treating the colonies in rebellion. Legally, treason was defined by the Treason Act of 1351, which included 7 treason statutes that ranged from violating the wife of the king or counterfeiting all the way to levying war against the king. However, government officials like Lord North and Alexander Wedderburn, as well as government supporters such as Adam Ferguson and James Macpherson, defined rebellion more broadly along the lines of Samuel Johnson's dictionary as merely resistance to lawful authority. This overly simplistic definition, which could just as easily be applied to 18th century protests or bread riots, allowed pro-government writers to construct a case for colonial rebellion against parliamentary supremacy. Memory also complicated concepts of what constituted rebellion or revolution. While Whigs like John Wilkes celebrated the Glorious Revolution, Tories and Jacobites viewed 1688 as an unlawful rebellion and attempted their own revolutions to return the Jacobite claimant to the throne. While both sides of the debates over American Rebellion reference different historical events, allusions to the Jacobite Rebellion were vehemently contested and demonstrate pro-government perceptions of American resistance. Historian Ian Christie was correct to suspect that Culloden influenced the British ministry in 1774 and 1775. In those tumultuous years and years to come, experiences in Scotland helped define policy in America, especially in constructing the case for colonial rebellion. The 45 continuously came up in parliamentary debates and the press. However, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus only on the earliest instances. Months before the First Continental Congress signaled unified resistance, and nearly a year before fighting began at Lexington and Concord, Lord North's administration took a rhetorical rebellious turn by comparing American resistance to the Jacobite Rebellion in the spring of 1774. Although the former Prime Minister George Grenville failed to declare rebellion during the Stamp Act crisis in 1765 by drawing the same comparison to 1745, the comparison became more commonplace in and out of Parliament after news of the Boston Tea Party reached London. In March 1774, an article in the London Chronicle argued that compelling the Americans into obedience was no different than coercing Scots back to loyalty in 1745. Only 3 weeks later, another article challenged this comparison and argued that a Scotch administration talked of levying 15,000 pounds, but the Scots received no similar penalty when they rebelled and cost Britain £1 million. During the House of Commons debate over the Impartial Administration of Justice Act for Massachusetts in April 1774, American sympathizer Colonel Isaac Beret attacked Prime Minister Lord North for, quote, goading the Americans into rebellion, and condemned altering trials by jury based on the precedent set in 1745. Originally printed in London, in April, news of this speech circulated widely in America, where no less than 13 newspapers in at least 5 different colonies printed it. Before any formal declaration of rebellion, the imperial government and the public used the 45 to frame American resistance as rebellious and call for coercive policies in the spring of 1774. Members of Parliament increasingly referenced the 45 as the North Ministry aggressively sought a declaration of rebellion in February 1775. Government supporters consistently maintained colonial rebellion with comparisons between the 45 and 75. Attorney General Edward Thurlow urged the House to consider the implications of Americans raising militias and seizing the king's arms. In alluding to the 45, he argued that preemptive action was necessary before the seeds of rebellion grew. After all, it would be foolish to wait until rebels united and were on the march to London. Similarly, the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, a Scotsman who matriculated at the University of Edinburgh during the 45, thought colonial resistance had gone too far. Urging firmness since the coercive acts, he argued that regardless of commerce, when a rebellion was in the bowels of the kingdom, it had to be resisted. Although this comment did not explicitly reference the 45, Wedderburn likely imagined it. Just weeks earlier, on January 19, 1775, Wedderburn told former Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson that General Thomas Gage ought to have secured the heads of the Congress and that the people in Scotland were better humored ever since the bloodshed in the rebellion of 45. Likewise, Member of Parliament Sir Robert Smith justified not hearing merchants' petitions because doing so would be the same as having stopped to hear the petitions from Preston and Manchester when rebels were in the heart of England. The opposition, pictured in the Parricide as destroying Britain, an image first depicted by James Macpherson's 1775 pro-government pamphlet, contested these comparisons between American resistance and the Jacobite Rebellion, but the opposition failed to win the debate. American sympathizers like Governor George Johnston maintained that the colonies could not be in rebellion because they were not levying war against the king, as stated in the 1351 Treason Act, and accused the administration of, quote, constructive treason, or in other words, inventing rebellion. Both John Wilkes and Edmund Burke drew on the 45 to show how different these events were. After Wilkes argued that America might eventually view the war as their glorious revolution, Wilkes added that their English forefathers spilt their blood to protect the country from Scottish traitors. Edmund Burke argued that the colonists did not resist sovereignty, but a certain exercise of that sovereignty, and that Americans did not seek to put a tyrant on the throne like the Jacobites. Much like Wilkes's reference to the Glorious Revolution, Burke feared that the Americans in 1775 were comparable to the English in 1745. Furthermore, the London Chronicle reported that the opposition also argued that real rebellion never required a declaratory vote, but was obvious to the world. After all, no vote was necessary in 1715 or 1745. This information was not limited to Parliament or even to London. Just 13 days before fighting began, Bostonians who perused the Boston newsletter could have read the speeches of Burke, Wilkes, and the London Chronicle's content in a single newspaper. Whether the true Whigs in 1745 or the Glorious Revolution, the opposition contested American similarities to the Jacobite rebels and justified American resistance. As late as May 22nd, 1776, General Henry Seymour Conway, a veteran of Culloden, continued to insist that the comparisons to the 45 were ridiculous and that Americans were not fighting to replace the king. They were defending their rights, the glorious privileges of the revolution. By the time of the debates over a declaration of rebellion in 1775, there were two different perceptions of rebellion. Both in and out of Parliament, Britons contested the memory of the 45 and its application to the American context over the course of 1775 and 1776. That this began with the Massachusetts Impartial Administration of Justice Act in April 1774 suggests that the North administration intentionally pursued rebellion long before Congress convened or fighting began. The supporters of coercion, including George III, viewed opposition to Parliament as grounds of rebellion, whereas Whigs in opposition claimed only attempts to displace sovereignty justified war. While debates over what constituted rebellion persisted into 1776, it was clear that pro-government officials were using the memory of the Jacobite Rebellion to construct a case for rebellion in America. Beyond declaring rebellion, the North Ministry and its supporters also employed the 45 to justify imperial policies that altered the imperial constitution and justified using foreign troops. However, equally important were the policies and practices that were not revived, an appreciable breach that did not go unnoticed by opposition Whigs. The opposition not only challenged the connection between the 45 and the use of foreign troops, but attacked imperial religious policies of the Anglican Church, as well as the government's economic policy regarding public credit. Combined, different memories of the 45 demonstrate how contested the American Rebellion and its likeness to the Jacobite Rebellion were. Whereas the Patriots of London were remembered to have rallied to support the government during the Jacobite Rebellion, the American conflict divided the nation and splintered the empire. Due to time constraints, I'm only going to highlight one of these four policies, that of foreign troops. Following the British defeats at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775, and the Battle of Bunker Hill the following June, George III introduced Hanoverian troops to Gibraltar and Minorca without parliamentary consent to allow more British troops to serve in America. This unilateral action ignited a heated debate in the House of Commons over the use of foreign auxiliary troops on February 29, 1776. Not only were many Whigs opposed to what was a possible constitutional infringement, many still challenged the justice of pursuing war in America. Perceiving Whig intransigence, Lord North questioned why so many resisted a, quote, speedy and effectual suppression, end quote, of the American Rebellion, since such opposition did not exist in 1690 towards the Irish or towards the Scots in 1715 and 1745. Lord George Germain, who served in the Scottish occupation in 1746, supported Lord North, claiming that foreign troops were used in every rebellion. The Whig opposition vehemently opposed the 45 as precedent for employing foreign mercenaries within the British Empire and often denied their presence in the Jacobite Rebellion. Sir George Savile criticized using foreign mercenaries since no similar bargain was made, even when rebellion existed in England. Alderman Bull also viewed this as unjustly founded on oppression. Looking to posterity, Bull asserted, "Let no historian be obliged to say that the Russian and German slave was hired to subdue the sons of Englishmen. After all," he argued, "George III owed his throne to the English who defended the Hanoverian dynasty during previous rebellions." However, the debate on February 29th, 1776 was not the first time the comparisons arose. On October 27th, 1775, foreign troops were justified by the 45 in the House of Commons, and on November 1st, 1775, the Duke of Richmond rejected the comparison made in the House of Lords. Although foreign mercenaries were present in the 45, many of them refused to take offensive operations. But regardless of whether foreign troops left a memorable impression or not, opposition Whigs denied their applicability in 1775. Government writers also carried the debate over foreign auxiliaries into the public sphere. Government writer John Lind supported foreign auxiliaries on the precedent of 1745 in his 1776 pamphlets, Three Letters to Dr. Price, as well as his answer to the Declaration of the American Congress. With an imperial perspective, Lind argued, "We have now taken the same means to suppress a rebellion in one part of the empire, America, that were taken 30 years ago to suppress a rebellion in another, Scotland." Lind accounted for employing foreign troops since the Glorious Revolution and even alluded to Cumberland using foreign troops at Culloden. As the North administration tried to convince the British public, its propaganda relied on the same justification for foreign troops it made in Parliament. The connection between the 45 and foreign troops was not uncontested or unilateral. Americans also sought foreign aid, and some used auxiliaries to criticize Britain's military superiority. In 1776, an American writer under the pseudonym Candidus criticized Thomas Paine's Common Sense for imbecility and insanity. Candidus reminded the American public that if France and Spain were interested in aiding them, there was no need to declare independence. After all, France and Spain supported the Jacobite rebels without a declaration in 1745. But Candidus cautioned the consequence of those deluded rebels. Although Candidus's criticism of Paine was correct, Paine did remember the 45 and included it in Common Sense in the 19 rebellions that occurred since William the Conqueror. In fact, Paine continuously used the 45 to challenge British military capabilities. And number 2 of Paine's The American Crisis, published January 13th, 1777, he argued that Britain never won a war without foreign aid, and that they barely beat the Jacobites in 1745 without auxiliaries. Paine even maintained this belief into the next century, informing Thomas Jefferson about a proposed French Jacobin invasion of Britain in 1800. Paine noted that during the 45, a small force penetrated to the center of England and nearly proved fatal to the Anglo-Hanoverian government. While Norse ministry claimed the 45 as precedent for using foreign troops, Whigs like Paine appropriated the connection to undermine faith in British military superiority. Beyond using the 45 to frame the rebellion, the American Rebellion, British politicians and the public applied memories of the 45 to other policies pertaining to the war in America. As Whigs contested government policies that altered the American legal system and introduced foreign troops, they also drew attention to forgotten religious and financial practices. Contrary to London's patriotic fervor embodied in Londoners' March to Finchley, no such unity would exist against the American colonists. Britons differed over how to proceed and continuously contested the memories that guided imperial policy. However, what made the 45 most poignant was that it did not reside in the historic past as the English Civil War or the Glorious Revolution. This memory was living, just as some of the Jacobite rebels. Whigs throughout the empire noticed a reversal of imperial roles, especially under the self-conscious patriot king, George III. former pariahs quickly found political preferment. The incorporation of those who had connections to disloyalty as an essential component to was an essential component to 18th century conspiratorial thinking, which often centered on real memories of treachery. While historian Gordon Wood aptly argued for conspiracy as a form of causal explanation for people spatially distant from power, conspiracy was also largely contingent on memory, the conceptual distance from real events in the past. The more recent the events, the more legitimate the conspiracy appeared. As formerly disloyal people and regions openly supported coercive policies in America and presented loyal addresses to the king, it suggested an ideological paradigm shift in imperial government. Fears of these disloyal officials, combined with shifts in imperial policy, made Parliament and locals loyal to it appear as rebels to the British Constitution in need of suppression. Just as precedent guided imperial policy, a loyal pedigree determined political fidelity. Corruptions of kinship were key to conspiratorial fears that focused on disloyal families, who maintained high-ranking roles in the imperial government in the 1770s. Legally, acts of attainder included the clause corruption of blood, which tainted immediate family members and prevented the transfer of inheritance of property or titles. But culturally, corruptions of kinship extended to both real and fictive bonds. Conspiratorial fears often centered on these disloyal connections among a Jacobite or Scotch junto of imperial officials who wielded influence and were related to Jacobites who rebelled in the 45. While a number of Scots were attacked in the press, the majority of the attention rested on three imperial officials: John Stuart, the third Earl of Bute, who served as Prime Minister; William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield, who was Lord Chief Justice; and British General Simon Fraser, the Master of Lovat. Although Bute was related to the Pretender, he had no other clear connections to the 45 or overt political Jacobitism. However, he did provide numerous Scots with patronage in the early 1760s, including Jacobites like Simon Fraser. Furthermore, he maintained powerful positions as George III's childhood tutor and prime minister. In fact, there was apprehension in colonial and London newspapers that George III had ideologically converted to Jacobitism, having been trained in the, quote, Scottish school, or a Stuart in principles, or laboring for the Pretender himself. In contrast to Bute, Mansfield and Fraser both had Jacobite fathers and family who ended up rebelling in the 45. Fraser even surrendered as a Jacobite in 1746, and his father, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was executed for treason in 1747. Although some feared a Jacobite plot to restore the young Pretender in the 1770s, much of the language tying contemporary Jacobitism to the 45 focused on the more realistic likelihood that Jacobites were altering the character or ideology of the British Empire from within. Beyond imperial officials, disloyal regions of the empire also seemed to shift loyalties. Long associated with a Jacobite and Tory interest, Oxford University accused opposition Whig Edmund Burke of abetting rebels in 1775. Likewise, Lancashire, which harbored disloyalty in 1745, was the first to issue a loyal address in support of coercive actions. Similarly, Manchester, which was the only English town who raised a Jacobite regiment during the 45, issued a loyal address as well, which some saw as a sign that George III was welcoming Jacobites. Even after the war, became global in 1778, political prints continued to emphasize the irony behind shifting loyalties. The Closet satirized Manchester's loyal address, scratching out Charles III, the young pretender, and instead addressing it to George III. Similarly, the review of the York Regiment depicted soldiers marching through the gate to preferment, and Anglican clergyman Archbishop Markham of York promoting soldiers trained at the Loyal School of Oxford. Meanwhile, an armed woman warned Britannia that Tories and Jacobites were never friends to the Brunswick line. Remember the years 15 and 45. However, one of the biggest shifts in regional loyalty was Scotland. Beyond the 41 burghs who submitted loyal addresses to the crown, 30 out of 33 Scottish counties sent loyal addresses supporting coercive policies. For fearful Whigs, the spatial inversion of loyalty seemed to prove that George III and his government had adopted Jacobitical principles. Corruptions of kinship also tainted the reception of the Quebec Act and Parliament's coercive policies. Of the colonial newspapers that tied the Quebec Act to corruptions and kinship, Parliament, the Boston Postboy contains an exceptional example. While attacking the Quebec Act for establishing Catholicism in Canada and excluding habeas corpus from its civil constitution, the article encouraged fear of former Jacobites and their sons or near relations whose ancestors held Jacobite principles and now wielded imperial power. A similar theme is evinced in the London magazine political print, The Thistle Reel, where Lord Mansfield, holding the Quebec Act, joins Lord Bute and Lord North around a thistle under a bagpipe playing devil. The translation of the text at the bottom, "No one provokes me with impunity," was the Latin motto of the Order of the Thistle and the Stuart dynasty. Conspiratorial ideas also linked corruptions of kinship to coercive imperial actions that treated the colonies as rebellious, and is particularly evident in the newspaper The Crisis and the political print Scotch Butchery. The Crisis continuously emphasized the role of corruptions and kinship in imperial government, but an excellent example appeared on January 13th, 1776, entitled Scotch Rebels and Traitors Triumphant. The article noted that although a rebel in 1745, Simon Fraser was one of the king's friends who disregarded the historically loyal Whigs. While attacking Fraser for rebelling in the 45, the article emphasized the disloyal connection to Fraser's contriving father, who pretended loyalty to Hanover while aiding the young pretender, just as Fraser could be doing in 1776. Furthermore, the article argued that the combination of imperial policy and preferment of formerly disloyal proved that Bute and Mansfield reigned. Printed in London just a day before the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Scotch Butchery, Boston, 1775, also included Bute, Fraser, and Mansfield. While English troops refused to fight the Americans, Bute and Mansfield command the Scottish troops to attack Boston, and as Fraser leads the Scotch Butchers, he holds a paper which reads, "Pardon, 1745. Not only did George III restore Fraser's family estate in 1774, which had been in government possession since the 45. In 1775, George III broke standard military policy of augmenting existing regiments to allow Fraser to raise his own regiment of Highlanders. Fraser was the only military officer permitted to do so before the French threatened to enter the war at the end of 1777. This sentiment of Scotch butchery it persists in America and even made its way into Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, where he decried Scottish alterity or otherness, lamenting that George III not only sent soldiers of our common blood, but Scotch and foreign mercenaries to destroy America. Royal preferment had not only reconciled Jacobite rebels, they were now leading the effort to suppress rebellion in America. The conspiratorial thinking that linked imperial officials and policies to historic disloyalty also manifested locally against American loyalists and helped transform allegiance to Parliament into treason. This intersection of memory, ideology, fear, and action can best be seen through the life and events surrounding John Adams and his family between 1775 and 1776. American fears of imperial officials are apparent in John Trumbull's mock epic poem, Macfingal, which demonstrates how corruptions of kinship affected policy and how support of such policies was treasonous. Written in the fall of 1775, Macfingal portrays a local New England debate between Honorarius, traditionally believed to be John Adams, and the fictitious Scottish loyalist Macfingal. The poem both explicitly highlights Scottish tendencies to rebel and implicitly undermines Scottish loyalty by appropriating the name of Fingal, of James Macpherson's Fingal, an ancient epic poem, which had been critical for culturally supporting Scottish integration into the British Empire after Culloden. Undermining Macfingal by his familial connection to previous rebellions, the poem begins by stating that with Bute and Mansfield, Macfingal joined the new Scottish rebellion against the church and state constitutions, on whose ruins these Scots hoped to raise a new empire. But unlike Macfingal's old king-destroying treason, this new rebellion would occur from inside the government. While Macfingal is an exceptional example of colonial perceptions in late 1775, John Adams engaged in a real-life debate over memories of rebellion and Jacobitism earlier that year. On January 30th, 1775, Massachusetts loyalist Daniel Leonard compared colonial resistance to the Jacobite Rebellion. Leonard contended that, like the colonists, Jacobites were also principled, yet were killed and received no sympathy from loyalists. In response, John Adams justified resistance against the late innovations of arbitrary power and Romish religion. Instead of colonial resistance being rebellious, Adams argued that being loyal to an unlawful parliament was an overt act of treason against His Majesty, and such loyalists were traitors to the Glorious Revolution. Finally, fears of imperial officials were not merely polemical either. Adherence to Whig principles and the memory of the 45 was intimately connected to John Adams and his family. In 1846, John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, recalled his mother Abigail having him recite William Collins' ode written in the beginning of the year 1746, after saying the Lord's Prayer each day in the spring and summer of 1775. This short poem emphasizes the virtue of British soldiers who fell fighting the Jacobites during the 45 and depicts the personifications of honor and freedom visiting the dead. Although 71 years later, John Quincy Adams was not misremembering. John Adams received word on April 4th, 1775, just 15 days before the first battles of the American Revolution, that John Quincy Adams had the ode by heart. Abigail Adams even copied the entirety of the ode in her letter to John, describing the death of Dr. Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. The fears of a Jacobite conspiracy and the need for patriotic fortitude in overcoming local and imperial rebels helped animate the Adams family. Increasingly faced with imperial policies that treated them as rebels, memories of disloyalty altered how American patriots treated those loyal to Parliament. While colonists opposing American resistance adopted the label loyalist at the end of 1774, to the chagrin of American patriots like Benjamin Franklin, American Whigs derided their loyalty by referring to them as Tories, Jacobites, modern Jacobites, and the Jacobite Party. For instance, before engaging in debate with John Adams, Daniel Leonard was accused of being a member of the high-flying Jacobite Party, and patriots drove him out of Taunton, Massachusetts. Likewise, a New York loyalist with the surname Murray, the same surname as Mansfield, had to exculpate himself from charges of Jacobitism and prove that he was not in Scotland in 1745. As tensions rose in 1774 and 1775, corruptions of kinship tainted the imperial government and its policies, and colonists loyal to a disloyal government appeared as traitors to the Constitution in need of suppression. Drawing on corruptions of kinship, Whigs on both sides of the Atlantic challenged perceived alterations in imperial government, which suggested an imperial paradigm shift. Although the fears of a Jacobite junto in the imperial government were inaccurate, such fears existed because the empire had markedly changed over the previous 30 years. In fact, the poem Macpherson was not alone in fearing the emergence of a new empire. In 1775, Continental Congress dated the origins of the American crisis, not to colonial taxation, not to the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, but a change of imperial government in 1761, when Bute entered office and William Pitt resigned. With a sea separating colony and metropole, and with a government contingent on trust, the living memory of the not-so-distant past exacerbated the imperial fissure and provided both the precedent for imperial policy and the reason to resist it. In a world turned upside down, loyalty became rebellion, but loyalists were traitors. To conclude, writing in 1777, shortly before the French entered the war, an officer returned from America chided the administration for comparing the American conflict to the 45. He contended that the situation in America was far worse than the Jacobite Rebellion. Soon, he said, the memory of the 45 would be reduced to a mere, quote, level of a romance, end quote. In 1778, the French officially entered the conflict as an American ally, both broadening the military theater and turning the rebellion into an inter-imperial war. The Spanish followed France in 1779, and the Dutch joined in 1780. The Howe brothers and other leading officials were blamed for failing to achieve a quick victory in the earliest years of the conflict. However, they were not solely culpable. The past had deceived the government. The North Ministry had used memory to justify their actions and guide imperial policy. But the American Revolution was not comparable to the Jacobite Rebellion. There would never be a 75. Memories of the 45 not only provided precedent for imperial policies, but further undermined faith in the imperial government. These memories of rebellion show how the North Ministry, supported by people and places with connections to Jacobitism, helped galvanize colonial resistance by aggressively pursuing rebellion in the colonies. That the 45 influenced imperial policies, which rejected negotiation in favor for coercion, helps explain the transition to war and further illuminates the failure of British policy in obtaining a peaceful resolution. Combined, the influence of the 45 on imperial policy and the real fear of corrupted kinships among imperial officials suggests a greater need for understanding the persistent influence of the 45 on the British Empire, particularly between 1746 and 1783. If the British Empire did not become a Scottish empire, as one historian has questioned, the experience of the 45 unequivocally altered the empire in ideological and material ways, influencing British policies in America. Although the 7 Years' War expanded the empire, it was the 45 that framed the spirit of 76. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tanner. That's a superb talk for an Easter Saturday evening. My brain is fizzing with ideas, as you can imagine. Not least, as Marius very kindly noted on the chat there, the reference to McFingal, given mine and Mari's recent publication of our book on James Macpherson, his history writing. Absolutely thrilled that you've included that reference. It's not something that we had come across before. And as Mari says on the chat there, loving the description of James as a Scotch ministerial scribbler, which by 1775 he absolutely was.
Sure.
Fascinating stuff. So thank you very much. Right, so let's open the floor to questions. Who would like to ask a question to Tanner?
I'll ask a quick one, Jim. It's Ewan.
Yeah, go for it, Ewan. Thanks.
Yeah, just Tanner know what happened to Lovett after that time. What was his future?
The son, the master of Lovett?
Yeah, sorry, yes, the master.
Yeah. So I've looked at all of his existing papers except one collection. As far as I know, he ends up dying in Scotland. He's buried in Kent, but he never goes to America for the American Revolution. But he helps raise a regiment that's sent there, as far as I know. But as far as his later life, I'm not entirely certain any details. Most of the correspondence that is actually there's an entire data set of correspondence from Ewan Macpherson and Simon Fraser and Ewan Macpherson's wife, who's the sister of Simon, at the Isle of Bute. So they have a Jacobite collection on Bute that deals with this. But most of the correspondence is from the 1760s. And then the early 1770s. So the end of his life, I'm not quite sure what happens.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. Any other questions for Tanner? Anything else folks would like to ask? Mari, go for it.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for that. I enjoyed that immensely. It's a period I'm very keen on as well. I have a two-part question for you. One of them is,
okay.
I always find it fascinating to hear why people are interested in the research, and it usually makes for a good story. So I'd love to hear more from you about why you're interested in this stuff and why you enjoy talking about it. And the second part is, do you have any good Macpherson anecdotes to share? At the museum, we're generally really intrigued by this stuff. So if you've come across any Macphersons in your research, we'd love to hear more about that as well.
So for the first question, like I said at the beginning, this is not where I intended to be, which has made me have to go through an entire scholarship that I was not prepared. Like I'm just cramming scholarship in all the time because I did not intend to do Scottish history. But what happened was I was actually interested in one of these opposition Whig networks that focused a lot on the English Civil War, which the article I published deals with. And they work behind the scenes a lot to influence culture. And I thought that was really interesting. And there's a lot of histories about the 17th century that come out right after the 45. So I was starting to look at that, and my advisor suggested maybe I should look at how the 45's remembered, because there's not very much on it. And I said to myself, I was like, there's Outlander, surely there is a lot of scholarship on this already because there's a pop history on it. So like this has to be done. And sure enough, the more I dived into it, the more British Imperial historians are guilty of a lot of things, but not paying attention to the fringes is a key one. And so a lot of people talking about the British Empire in America were not talking about the Jacobite Rebellion. And the more I delved into it, the more I noticed that it seemed to be this broader pattern of a lot of pro-government officials pushing this narrative that it's just like the 45, and I wasn't seeing that in the scholarship. So I then got more and more interested in it, and then got really interested in Simon Fraser, the Master of Lovett, because he's just an interesting character, as well as Flora MacDonald and some other, better, well-known names. But for the second question, I think the parricide was the big one that I found interesting, because I didn't find this in the scholar. It might be in the new book. I haven't had a chance to read the new book on James Macpherson because it just came out in February. But I've requested my library purchase it, so hopefully there's some royalties coming to someone. But the parricide piece was a big part that I didn't come across in scholarship. I came across on my own because I was reading his pro-government pamphlet, hoping that he did mention the 45, which he doesn't. But I was looking for it, and I'm reading it, and I'm like, wow, you're describing this print exactly how this print is. And sure enough, I looked it up and found the original magazine that has a narrative on it. And the person just plagiarizes James Macpherson's pamphlet and explains his pamphlet was the cause for this political print. And it's anonymous, so I don't know, it could have been just James Macpherson citing himself, I guess. But it's one of those things that I thought was super interesting, and maybe that would be a good addition to the museum to show that James Macpherson is responsible, whether he actually made it himself. He's responsible for that political print that pops up in every major history of the American Revolution. So that's all I have. Thank you for the clip.
No, thank you very much for this. I am so annoyed that we didn't find this when we were editing the book. We could have made that link, so sorry about that. And we haven't been sent a PDF by the publisher yet, so we can't share. I'm very sorry about that. But no,
Sure.
that is utterly fascinating, and I love the idea that James, who gets accused of being a plagiarist, which he isn't, then gets plagiarized by someone else, or possibly did it himself. That just makes my heart sing. Thank you very much.
Sure. You're welcome.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. I think that sense of the political impact that James Macpherson has is really comes through in that anecdote, isn't it? It's quite something that he is shaping debate on both sides of the Atlantic in really important ways. You're absolutely right. It's astonishing, isn't it? I was just racking my brains as you were talking, thinking, oh crap, we missed a reference to the Jacobites but there's nothing on the Jacobites in James Macpherson's pamphlet. He narrates a very different story of the evolution of the British imperial state and how the constitution is fundamentally imperial in nature, and he totally eschews the Jacobite perspective entirely, which is fascinating. So yeah, thank you for that. That's wonderful. As Mari says, would have been lovely to have had a nice reference to to your things in the book, but oh well, that's the nature of academic work. We publish on very different timescales, and we tend to miss each other like ships in the night. But that's wonderful. I suppose I've got a sort of a related question to your focus on the impact of the Jacobites on debate about the American Revolution. I was wondering if you'd come across anything on the flip side of this, the impact of the American Revolution on how the Highlands conceptualized itself in the 1770s and 1780s. Just, I think it was yesterday, that there was an exchange on Twitter between Andrew McKillop, historian I'm sure you know, and Frank Rennie, academic on Lewis, and Jim Hunter, who was saying, oh yes, was Thomas Paine read in the Highlands? What was the impact of Paine up here? So just wondering if you come across any references in your research that illustrate that sort of that imperial blowback of the debate that shapes the revolution, then coming back up here and shaping debate towards the end of the 18th century.
Yeah, I have not. And to be fair, most of my archival digging has been in the 60s and the early 70s a little bit, but the thing that's extremely frustrating for me is most of the main characters in my research, their papers are either burned. So Mansfield's papers are burned during the Gordon riots. And then you have people self-destructing, they're just destroying them themselves. And then survival. So the key archive for me so far has been Butte. Some of Mansfield's stuff are at Scone, but mostly it's his nephew Stormont, who becomes the second Earl Mansfield. So it's one of those things that I'm most of what I've done so far has been 1760s, so not a whole lot of being able to see the influence yet. But hopefully eventually. I'll keep thinking about that. That's a good question.
Well, I think for the next book, well, once you've got the PhD out of the way and published that as a book, the second book is looking at the flipping the coin, looking at the impact on this side of the Atlantic. That'd be great, and in the Highlands specifically. I think Jim Hunter was saying that he's come across a reference somewhere to Paine being translated into Gaelic, which is absolutely intriguing. So that's one to follow up on.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I did not know about that. So that is interesting.
Absolutely intriguing, and how it shapes debate about early resistance to clearance, like the year of the sheep in 1792 and that kind of thing. So Paine is being used here in very specific localized context. Really interesting. Cool, fantastic. Any other questions for Tanner? Anything else folks would like to ask? Wow, fabulous. I think we'll draw things to a close there. Thank you so much, Tanner, and thank you everyone for your contributions. A wonderful way to spend an Easter Saturday evening. So thank you very much for that. Our next talk is, oh my goodness, my brain has gone completely blank. We have Thomas Archambault coming to talk to us. Isla, I'm hoping you might come to my rescue here. I can't remember the date. It's sometime. Sorry, Isla.
The 20th of May, on Macpherson's in India.
Fantastic. So we'll look forward to hearing Thomas talking about, and please do come along if you can. But all that remains to say is a huge thank you once again to Tanner. Hugely appreciated, and thank you everyone for coming. So bye for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.